It was a crisp morning in Briarwood Heights, California, when Sarah Carter stood at the window, watching her children play in the front yard. The autumn air carried the scent of dried leaves, a reminder of change, the same change she felt stirring deep within her. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone at peace. It was the smile of a woman caught in a life that no longer fulfilled her. Sarah had it all: an ideal family, a loving husband, 2 beautiful children, and a house in the quiet suburban streets of Briarwood Heights. She was active in her community, a trusted member of her church, and known for her kind heart and warm smile. But beneath the surface, something was slowly unraveling. The picture-perfect life she worked so hard to maintain was crumbling in ways no one could see. James Carter, her husband of 12 years, had always been her rock, or so she thought. A dedicated man, a respected elder in their church, and a father who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, James had always been the model of responsibility. But somewhere along the way, their marriage had become a routine, a checklist of daily tasks with little room for intimacy. His long hours at the office, his volunteer work with the church, his commitment to the kids, it was all consuming. And Sarah? She was left to manage the home, the children, and everything else that fell through the cracks, all the while watching as the passion and love she once shared with James slowly faded into nothing. She had tried everything to feel connected to him again: dinners together, weekends away, even late-night talks, but nothing seemed to spark the chemistry they once had. It wasn't that she didn't love him anymore, it was just that she needed something more, something deeper, something that made her feel alive. And that's when Dr. David Collins entered her life. Dr. Collins had been their family doctor for years, a kind man in his early 40s with a calm demeanor and the kind of compassionate professionalism that made him a trusted figure in their community. But for Sarah, he became more than just a doctor. Over the past few months, she had begun to notice the way he listened to her when she spoke, truly listened. When she mentioned feeling overwhelmed with her responsibilities, when she confessed to him how distant James had become, Dr. Collins didn't just offer a medical solution, he offered something else: understanding. He didn't just hear her words, he saw the loneliness behind them, the frustration, the yearning for something more. At first, it was nothing more than a few quiet conversations after her routine checkups. A comment here, a nod there, but slowly, Sarah began to feel like someone truly cared. She began to look forward to her appointments, not for her health, but for the attention and comfort Dr. Collins provided. In a world that had grown distant, his presence became a beacon of warmth. She confided in him, more and more, about her struggles with James, the stagnation of their marriage, the isolation she felt despite being surrounded by people who loved her. And every time she spoke, Dr. Collins nodded with such empathy, as though he truly understood. He seemed to be the only one who truly saw her. But it was more than that. In the quiet moments of those sessions, Sarah began to notice the way Dr. Collins looked at her. His eyes lingered just a little longer than necessary, a warmth behind them that stirred something inside of her. At first, she dismissed it. He was a doctor, a professional. But as their conversations grew deeper, the line between doctor and patient began to blur. She felt it, an unspoken connection, a spark between them that neither of them could ignore. One late afternoon, after her appointment, Sarah lingered outside the clinic, her car parked along the curb. She felt uneasy, but also exhilarated, as though something she couldn't name was rising to the surface. She had never experienced this before, this feeling of being seen in a way she hadn't been in years. The way he had looked at her, truly looked at her, was intoxicating. The next week, Dr. Collins was waiting for her in the lobby, his eyes meeting hers as she walked in. There was a quiet understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had been building. He didn't have to say a word. Just the way he greeted her with that slight smile, the way his eyes softened as he asked about her week, it all made her heart race, made her feel something stir deep within her. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she was more than just a mother, more than just a wife. She felt desired, seen, heard. It was a dangerous feeling. She knew it. She could feel the warning bells in the back of her mind, the part of her that told her this wasn't right. She was married. She had children. She had a life. Yet, as she looked at Dr. Collins, really looked at him, she couldn't help but feel drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. The next several weeks passed in a blur. More appointments, more stolen moments of connection. The emotional weight between them grew heavier, more undeniable. Sarah began to rely on him more and more, not just for medical advice, but for solace, for the understanding she couldn't get from James. The more she shared, the more he seemed to understand her, the more she began to crave his attention. One evening, after another long day of managing the kids, the house, and the fading remnants of her marriage, Sarah found herself texting Dr. Collins, arranging to meet for a walk in the park after her kids had gone to bed. The thrill of secrecy, the thrill of doing something forbidden, coursed through her veins. She was drawn to him, and she knew it was wrong, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive again. That night, as she met Dr. Collins beneath the towering oak trees of Briarwood Heights Park, Sarah felt a mix of fear and excitement, a heady cocktail that clouded her judgment. In the shadows, away from the prying eyes of their small community, they talked, and for a moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. As they walked closer, their shoulders brushed, and Sarah felt the heat of his skin, just the briefest contact, but it ignited something in her, something she had buried deep inside for so long. In that moment, Sarah realized something she had been denying for months. She wasn't just lonely. She wasn't just seeking attention. She was desperate for someone to make her feel desired, to make her feel whole again. And Dr. Collins was the answer. But what would that mean for her marriage? What would it mean for her children? And more importantly, what would it mean for the rest of her life? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain: Sarah had crossed a line. The quiet suburban life she had built with James was no longer enough to hold her. The shadows had crept in, and she didn't know how to stop them. The days following their secret meeting in Briarwood Heights Park blurred into one another. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Dr. David Collins. She told herself it was just a fleeting moment, an escape from her mundane reality, but deep down, she knew it was more. The way his touch had sent a jolt through her body, the way his eyes held her with a warmth that spoke louder than words, it lingered long after they parted ways. She had crossed a line, and yet, for the first time in years, she felt something other than the suffocating weight of routine and obligation. Each appointment with Dr. Collins became a new chapter in a story she wasn't sure she wanted to finish but couldn't stop herself from continuing. What had started as innocent conversations about her health, her stress, and her struggles with James quickly evolved into late-night confessions, moments where Sarah bared her soul in a way she never could with her husband. She spoke of her loneliness, of the hollow space where passion once lived in her marriage. Dr. Collins listened, his gaze soft, but intense. Each time she shared more of herself, she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a look that made her feel like she wasn't alone in her pain. And that, more than anything, was what kept her coming back. Her life outside of those appointments seemed increasingly distant. The smile she wore for James and the children began to feel more like a mask than a reflection of her true self. She would cook dinner, help with homework, and kiss her kids goodnight, all the while her mind would drift to Dr. Collins. What did he think of her? Was he feeling the same way? And if he was, what would that mean? Could she really risk everything for this feeling, this connection that seemed to be growing between them? It was on one particularly cold night in November when things began to shift. Sarah had just finished putting the kids to bed, the house quiet and still, when her phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Collins. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words, "Can we talk tonight? I can't stop thinking about our last conversation." The excitement and dread that rushed through her were immediate. She knew it was wrong, she knew that the deeper they went into this, the harder it would be to turn back. But the temptation, the pull towards something she hadn't felt in so long, was overpowering. She told herself she wasn't doing anything wrong. After all, James hadn't noticed her absence, hadn't seen how much she was yearning for a connection, for someone to truly see her. With trembling hands, she replied, "I'll meet you at the usual spot." The walk to the park felt different this time. There was a tension in the air, an undeniable electricity that crackled between her and the night. As Sarah approached the familiar oak tree, she saw Dr. Collins waiting, leaning casually against the trunk, his figure outlined by the pale glow of a street lamp. He straightened up as she approached, his expression softening as his eyes met hers. For a moment, everything else faded, the park, the quiet streets of Briarwood Heights, the distant hum of life moving forward without them. All that mattered was the space between them. "I've been thinking about you," he said softly, his voice steady but laced with something Sarah couldn't quite place, something raw and vulnerable. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "David, we can't keep doing this." His gaze didn't waver. "Why not?" He reached out, placing a hand on her arm, his touch gentle but firm. "We're two people who understand each other. You felt it too, haven't you?" His words, so simple, yet so profound, sent a wave of warmth flooding through her. She had felt it, felt the way her pulse quickened whenever he was near, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. It was dangerous, and yet, in that moment, it felt like the most alive she had ever been. "I don't know what I'm doing," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if this is real. But every time I'm with you, I feel seen. I feel like I'm more than just a mother or a wife. I'm me. And I haven't felt that in years." Dr. Collins stepped closer, his thumb brushing against the inside of her wrist, sending a shiver down her spine. "You're more than that, Sarah. You're someone who deserves to feel loved, wanted. I can give you that." His words, so simple, so direct, were a balm to the ache she had been carrying for so long. She had longed for this kind of attention, this kind of affection, and here it was, offered freely by a man who seemed to understand her better than anyone else. For a moment, Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the heat of his touch, the weight of his presence. It was intoxicating, the way he made her feel as though the world had stopped spinning just for her. She had never been one to act impulsively, but with Dr. Collins, it felt like everything was aligned, like she was being drawn into something inevitable. "I've never felt this way before," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet of the park. "But I'm scared, David. What if we get caught? What if everything falls apart?" Dr. Collins cupped her face gently, lifting her chin so she met his gaze. His touch was tender, but his eyes held an intensity that made her heart race. "Sometimes, the things that feel the most forbidden are the things we need the most." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the pull toward him grow stronger, deeper. This was no longer just a fleeting moment of connection. It was something more, a bond that was beginning to take root in the very fabric of her life. The kiss came before Sarah had a chance to second-guess herself. It was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the waters. But as their lips met, all the doubts, all the fears, seemed to dissolve. She kissed him back with a desperation that surprised her, as though she were trying to make up for lost time, for years of feeling invisible, unimportant. And just like that, the line between right and wrong blurred. They were no longer just two people, doctor and patient, husband and wife. They were something else entirely. Something forbidden. Something dangerous. But it was something that made Sarah feel alive again. When they pulled apart, both of them breathless, the weight of what they had just done settled over them like a thick fog. Sarah felt a rush of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the feeling of something deeper, something that terrified her even more than the consequences of their actions. Dr. Collins looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We can't go back, Sarah," he said softly, his voice a low murmur. "We've crossed a line, and there's no going back." Sarah's heart raced as she realized the truth of his words. She had crossed that line, and now there was no turning back. The decision she had made, the path she had chosen, would lead them both into territory they might not be able to escape from. And as she walked back to her car, her mind swirling with confusion, desire, and fear, one thought stood out among the chaos in her head: this was only the beginning. The days after that night in the park were a blur. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was living two lives, one in the light, where she was a devoted wife, a caring mother, and an active member of her community, and the other, hidden in the shadows, where she was the woman who met Dr. Collins in secret, who kissed him with a longing she hadn't felt in years. Each day, as she moved through her daily routine, the weight of the secret grew heavier, pressing on her chest like a stone that refused to be ignored. At home, she went through the motions. She greeted James with a warm smile, helped Eli with his homework, and tucked Emma into bed. But every time she looked at her family, the guilt clawed at her insides. She was supposed to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, but she wasn't. She was someone who was betraying the very family she had worked so hard to build. And worse, she was enjoying it. James had no idea. He continued with his work, his church duties, his endless commitments, unaware of the tension that was silently building between them. Sarah had always been the strong one, the one who kept everything together, but now, she was falling apart. She found herself constantly lost in thought, her mind drifting to Dr. Collins. The guilt would surface briefly, like a wave threatening to swallow her, but then the memory of his touch, his smile, his voice would push it aside. She couldn't help herself, she needed him. But the secrecy was beginning to take its toll. The late nights spent texting Dr. Collins, the stolen moments when she would step away from her family for errands that lasted longer than expected, all of it was starting to show. James, as absorbed as he was in his own work and church duties, began to notice the changes in her. He'd catch her staring off into space, a faraway look in her eyes, or find her distracted while they ate dinner together. At first, he chalked it up to stress. She had been under a lot of pressure lately, managing the household, caring for the kids, and keeping up with her church activities. But there was something else. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he could feel it. The distance between them was growing. One evening, after Sarah had come home late from an errand, James asked her, his voice tinged with concern, "Is everything okay? You've been acting different lately." Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She forced a smile, but it felt stiff, unnatural. "I'm fine, James. Just tired, I guess." But James wasn't convinced. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. He had never been one to question her, to doubt her, but now there was something in the air, a crack in the perfect veneer of their marriage. He knew it wasn't just stress, it was something more. "You've been distant," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Are you sure nothing's going on?" The words struck her like a slap in the face. She could feel the weight of her secret pressing down on her, suffocating her. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to confess the affair, to explain that it wasn't his fault, that she had been craving something more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded, offering a strained smile. "Really, James? It's nothing. I'm just exhausted." But inside, her stomach churned. She couldn't keep lying to him, but she couldn't face the truth, either. She was stuck in a web of deceit, tangled in her own emotions. Part of her hated herself for what she was doing, for betraying the man who had stood by her all these years. But another part of her, the part that craved Dr. Collins, that wanted to feel alive again, wasn't ready to let go of the affair. As the days went on, the tension only grew. Sarah couldn't hide it anymore. She found herself snapping at James over trivial things, losing her patience with the kids, and spending more and more time away from home. Every time she was with Dr. Collins, the world felt right again. He made her feel like she was important, like she mattered. He listened to her in a way James never had time to. He understood her loneliness, her frustration, her desires. And as their meetings continued, as their stolen moments grew longer and more intimate, Sarah felt herself slipping further away from the life she had once known. But the guilt never truly left her. Every time she saw James, every time she looked into his eyes, she felt a pang of regret. The face of the man who had loved her for so many years, the father of her children, the man who still believed in their marriage, how could she betray him like this? How could she turn her back on everything they had built together? It all came to a head one evening when James confronted her again. He had been quiet for weeks, watching her, observing her behavior, and now the silence had become unbearable. He could no longer ignore the cracks in their marriage. He needed answers. They needed to talk. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of the overhead light. The kids were in bed, the house quiet except for the sound of their breathing. James looked at Sarah with a seriousness she had never seen before. "Sarah, I need to know what's going on. You've been distant, and I don't know how to fix this if I don't know what's wrong. Are you unhappy with me? Is there something I don't know?" Sarah's heart raced. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the suffocating weight of her lies threatening to crush her. She opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she tell him the truth? How could she confess to the affair, to the betrayal that had slowly been consuming her? Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a brief moment, she felt the crushing weight of what she was doing to her family. She could feel the warmth of James's hand reaching across the table, his touch a silent plea for her to tell him what was wrong. But she couldn't. She couldn't tell him the truth. I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what's wrong, James. I just feel lost. And I don't know how to fix it." James looked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Lost? You've been distant for months, Sarah. And now you tell me you don't know how to fix it?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, a lump of guilt and fear that she couldn't swallow. She wanted to explain, to tell him about Dr. Collins, but she knew that once she spoke the truth, everything would be destroyed. There would be no going back. And so, the silence lingered between them, heavier than ever. The rift in their marriage had widened, and Sarah didn't know how to bridge it. The lie she had been living, the affair that had given her a fleeting sense of freedom and desire, was now threatening to tear apart the family she had worked so hard to build. The truth was out there, hanging in the air like a dark cloud, and Sarah knew that sooner or later, it would come crashing down. But for now, she had to keep pretending, to keep living the lie. Because once the truth came out, everything, her family, her life, her future, would be irrevocably changed. The days following Sarah's confrontation with James felt like a heavy fog settling over her life. Every word, every glance exchanged with him was laced with the unbearable weight of the secret she was carrying. The guilt gnawed at her, clawing at the edges of her mind, and yet, the pull toward Dr. Collins was undeniable. Her desire for him, her need for the connection he provided, consumed her in a way that she couldn't escape. But now, it wasn't just the affair that weighed on her, it was the looming threat of discovery, of everything being exposed. Her marriage, her family, the life she had known, all of it hung by a fragile thread, and she could feel it slowly unraveling. The distance between her and James had reached a breaking point. They lived in the same house, ate the same meals, and shared the same space, but the emotional gap between them was impossible to ignore. Sarah had tried to mask it, to pretend that everything was fine, but she knew that James could feel the shift. His suspicions had only grown stronger, and she could see it in his eyes, the way he watched her now, as though he were waiting for her to crack, to reveal what she was hiding. One evening, as the shadows of dusk crept across their home, Sarah found herself once again sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she stirred the pot of soup before her. James was in the other room, his focus fixed on his laptop as he worked on something for the church. The normalcy of the moment should have been comforting, but it felt suffocating instead. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall was louder than ever, each tick a reminder of the time running out. The plan had begun to form in her mind over the last few days, taking shape in the quiet, restless hours when she was alone with her thoughts. She had tried to dismiss it, to convince herself that it was an impossible idea, a fleeting fantasy brought on by fear and desperation. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way to escape the suffocating grip of her life. Dr. Collins had been persistent, his messages, his calls, growing more urgent as the days passed. They both knew that their secret could not stay hidden forever. Dr. Collins had told her more than once that they couldn't let James expose them. That their lives would be ruined, that their affair would destroy everything they had built. And then, one night, he had said something that shifted the course of Sarah's thoughts. "We need to take control, Sarah," he had said, his voice low, almost a whisper through the phone. "If James finds out, it's over. You won't just lose your marriage, you'll lose everything. You have to make a choice." It wasn't the first time he had spoken like this, but this time, there was a cold certainty in his voice that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. And that night, she found herself at a crossroads. The weight of her choices, of her actions, was too much to bear. She was trapped in a life that felt like a cage, and every day, the bars grew tighter. The fear of losing Dr. Collins, of losing the only part of herself that made her feel alive, threatened to swallow her whole. It was then that the thought crept in, uninvited but insistent, a thought she could not ignore: what if James didn't have to find out? What if I could just make him go away? The idea was ludicrous, she knew that. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the only option. Dr. Collins had made it sound so simple. He had the means, the knowledge. He was a doctor, after all. He could make it look like an accident, an overdose. No one would ever suspect. And if James were out of the picture, then she and Dr. Collins could finally be free. They could be together, without the constant fear of being caught. Sarah shook her head, trying to banish the thought. But it refused to go. She couldn't unthink it, couldn't pretend it wasn't there. The tension between her love for Dr. Collins and her loyalty to her family was tearing her apart. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions: love, guilt, fear, desire, but one thing stood out above them all: desperation. That night, after dinner, when James had retreated to his study, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She went upstairs to their bedroom and locked the door behind her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she took a deep breath, clutching her phone in her hand. Her fingers shook as she dialed Dr. Collins's number, and within moments, his voice was in her ear, calm, yet filled with an edge of urgency. "I've made up my mind," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if saying the words out loud might make them more real. "I can't live like this anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Dr. Collins spoke. "Are you sure, Sarah? Once we do this, there's no going back." She closed her eyes, her pulse racing. "I can't let him ruin everything. I don't have a choice." Dr. Collins's voice softened. "You're doing the right thing. We'll make it look like an accident. You won't have to live in fear anymore. We'll be together, Sarah. I promise." The conversation ended, and Sarah sat in the silence of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. As the hours passed, she went over the plan again and again in her mind, rehearsing every detail. Dr. Collins had said it would be easy. Slip something into James's medication, something that would mimic the symptoms of an overdose, but would never raise suspicion. It was so simple, and yet, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her as she prepared to go through with it. The next night, when James returned home late from church, Sarah knew the time had come. He was tired, distracted from his day. Sarah watched as he poured himself a drink, a glass of whiskey, and slumped into his chair with a sigh of exhaustion. This was her moment. She had already prepared everything. The medication was in her pocket, hidden in plain sight. The plan was simple: slip it into his drink, wait for the signs, then let nature take its course. No one would question it. No one would ever know. As she walked into the living room, she felt a strange calm. Her hands didn't shake. She wasn't afraid. She was determined. "James," she said softly, her voice steady. "You've had a long day. I thought you might need a little something to help you relax." He smiled wearily at her. "Thanks, Sarah. You're always thinking of me." As he took a sip from his glass, Sarah's heart raced. She stood there, watching him, the weight of the decision settling on her like a heavy cloak. And for a moment, as he relaxed back into the chair, she almost felt as if everything would be okay. She would be free. She and Dr. Collins would finally have the life they deserved. But as she watched James's eyelids grow heavy and his breathing slow, doubt began to creep in. The plan was working. But was it worth it? There was no turning back now. The house was eerily quiet. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, its rhythmic beat echoing through the room, marking the passage of time. Sarah stood in the living room, her eyes fixed on James as he lay slumped in his chair, unconscious. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. The guilt that had weighed on her before was now replaced by a strange, hollow emptiness. She had done it, she had taken the first step to free herself from the suffocating life she had been living. But now that it was done, she wasn't sure how to feel. The silence in the house felt oppressive, as if it were closing in on her, and Sarah knew that she couldn't stay in this moment forever. The plan had worked. James's breathing was slow, shallow, but steady. He looked peaceful, as if he had fallen into a deep, restful sleep. But deep down, Sarah knew that something irreversible had just happened. As she stood there, her mind raced. What now? What would happen when the morning came and James didn't wake up? She had been so focused on the plan, on executing every detail, that she hadn't thought about what came after. She didn't know how to cover her tracks. She didn't know how to explain what had happened if anyone asked. But Dr. Collins had promised her that everything would be fine. He had assured her that no one would suspect a thing, that the overdose would be deemed an accident. He was a doctor, after all, and his expertise would make it look like a tragic mistake. He had calmed her nerves, told her it would all be over soon, that they could start a new life together, free from the lies and the guilt. But standing there now, looking at James's motionless form, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She took a step forward, her feet heavy, as if she were wading through thick mud. The weight of the decision crushed her chest, and for a moment, she almost turned back. Almost called Dr. Collins to stop the plan, to undo what she had just done. But then she saw his face in her mind, the face of the man who had listened to her, who had made her feel alive again. He had promised her freedom. He had promised her love. He had promised that they would be together. As Sarah turned to leave the room, the phone rang. The sound cut through the heavy silence, making her jump. Her heart leapt into her throat as she grabbed the phone, hoping it was Dr. Collins, ready to reassure her that everything was going according to plan. But the moment she saw the caller ID, her stomach dropped. It was the hospital. Sarah Carter, the voice on the other end asked, the tone formal, almost detached. "Yes, this is Sarah," she answered, her voice shaky. "Ma'am, we need you to come down to the hospital immediately. There has been an issue with your husband's medication. His condition is critical. We're not sure how he ingested the overdose, but it looks like it was intentional. The blood drained from Sarah's face. The words didn't make sense. She felt as though the world around her was spinning, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. She gripped the phone tighter, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be an accident. The plan was foolproof, wasn't it? "Where is he?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're doing everything we can, but you need to get here now," the nurse urged, her voice sharp, insistent. Without another word, Sarah dropped the phone. Her knees buckled as she stumbled back against the wall. The weight of what she had done crashed over her in waves, and she was unable to stop herself from shaking. She had planned it all so carefully, but she hadn't accounted for this. She hadn't accounted for the unpredictable nature of life. Frantic, Sarah rushed to the car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every moment that passed was one more step away from the life she had once known, one more step toward a reality she had never imagined. When she arrived at the hospital, the sterile, fluorescent lights felt suffocating. Her heart raced in her chest as she hurried through the hallways, her mind a blur of fear and confusion. She couldn't think straight. She couldn't process what was happening. All she could think about was James, her husband, her partner, lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, all because of the choice she had made. As she entered the emergency room, she was greeted by a team of doctors and nurses who moved with swift efficiency, their faces grim. They didn't look at her with pity or sympathy, only with the cold professionalism that came with dealing with life and death on a daily basis. Sarah was led to a small waiting room, where she was left alone, her thoughts spinning out of control. Minutes stretched into hours. Finally, a doctor entered the room, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice low, "your husband is stable for now, but his condition is still critical. The overdose was severe. We've done everything we can to stabilize him, but we're not sure what the outcome will be." Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Her body went numb. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She wanted to scream, to tell them it was all a mistake, that she never meant for any of this to happen, but the words stuck in her throat. "We'll keep you updated," the doctor added before turning to leave. "But for now, we need to monitor him closely." As Sarah sat there, the full weight of her actions began to settle in. She had crossed a line, one that she could never uncross. The lies, the affair, the murder plot, it had all led her here, to a place she never thought she'd find herself. The choices she had made had set in motion a series of events that could never be undone. She had chosen to betray her husband, to betray her family, all for the fleeting promise of freedom and love. But now, it wasn't just her marriage at stake, it was her entire life. She had placed everything she held dear on the line, and she was losing it all. The guilt consumed her, and as she sat alone in that cold waiting room, she realized that even if James survived, she would never escape the consequences of what she had done. What do you think of Sarah's decision? Was it the right one? Do you think she could have found another way out of her marriage, or was there no other choice for her? Let us know what you think in the comments below. What would you have done in her shoes? Don't forget to like and share the video to continue the conversation.